Hello there, and welcome to your game review. I apologize for the delay. So, in this game you mentioned you did not really get much from the opening, but I think you got the perfect position. For example, here. After all, the point of the opening is not to win the game. That would be a bit too much. And the point of the opening is to get a decent position which you hopefully understand better than the opponent, and a position that you can play for a win. And here, all the pieces are on the board. You have the center. There's a lot of tension. So the position is great. With d5, e5. So now we get this advanced French structure. And in the advanced French, this bishop does not really look well on g7. Black can play f6 to improve the bishop, but then we will get a different advanced French structure after taking, where black will have weaknesses on e5 and e6. So this is what happened. You played bishop f4, maybe taking was a bit simpler, but okay, here is fine. And the black could have exchanged the pieces on e5 to change the structure. And now after e6, they wouldn't have this weakness on the e5 and e6 squares. So perhaps this should have been allowed. Here it seems black has at least some easy moves. And the bishop might come out to b5 at some point. So instead, knight f6 is played, so we got the structure that I mentioned. Black has weaknesses on the e6 and e5 squares. He has the bad bishop on c8, which usually will not be able to come out. So white's plan ideally should be to put a rook on e1, maybe even double on the e file, and try to take the weaknesses. So queen b3, but this is kind of on the other side of the board. As mentioned, probably white should play on the e file, but okay. Eventually we castled, knight h5 takes, and the knight e2, so it's true that this knight is badly placed. Ideally it would be well placed on e5, but at the moment it is quite far away. But okay, knight e2 and bishop c2, but this move already is a bit strange. I guess you're trying to improve the queen somewhere, but there's nothing wrong with starting to develop the pieces. White might want to play f4 as well to solidify the square on e5, but a move such as rook a2 e1 comes to mind, and now the bishop can go all the way back to b1, so that it's not in the way. But generally this bishop is not very important in the structure, at least not for the moment. So bishop c2, knight f4. So we got this piece exchanges, and black is quite active on the f file, but white could take the c file as well. And after all, open files have to be taken, and they have to be used for invasions. So probably the simplest plan is to play rook a1 and rook c7. So this is what you did. Bishop d7, rook ac1. And again, white always has a good small advantage here, because he is the one that controls the play. Black always has to be passive and defend these squares, while black can attack f2, but it's quite easy to defend. Rook f8, rook d2, and bishop b5. So it seems black is trying to activate the bishop, but the bishop on b5 is not very safely placed. White can just kick it away. And sure, putting a pawn on a light square is not ideal, but at the same time, we might have ideas of putting it on a5, fixing the structure on light squares, which will always be good for us, since we have a light squared bishop against another light squared bishop. For example, after bishop d7, you can now kick away the rook. On f3, it's not really safe, because after queen e1, rook to bishop to d1 is threatened. But of course, it is quite scary to allow the rook to invade here. Okay, rook e1, rook f7, f3. Of course, f3 is a move that we don't really want to play, but it does solve the problems after all. So now white should probably try to exchange things and take the c file, as this is the only open file. Both sides aren't really fighting for this file, so white can be the one to take it and start to invade. Again, this bishop can always be kicked away. Queen g5, king h2, queen h6. So black isn't really threatening anything, but he is trying to not allow white to move the pieces. For example, we can't double. If queen e6, then rook f3 is black's big idea. So all of this is not ideal, but if we start threatening queen e6, then black will again be forced to be passive. You'll have to either put the rook on e7 or f6, or the bishop back to d7, and then we can try to reroute again. So ideally, white would probably like to exchange queens, as they are not really threatening the opponent's king with such pieces. But in the endgame, black will always have to be passive on e6, and white will be able to create another weakness. So for example, bishop d1, with the idea of playing g3 and exchanging queens, should probably be the best course of action. Okay, after rook d1, black exchanges the queens themselves, and now again white gets a position with no risk. Now it's time to play for the c-file. After rook c7, king g3. This is fine, as we will need the king after all. It might even go quite far away, even if the rooks get exchanged. After rook c4, black is getting some activity. And finally, after rook f7, bishop b3, here was black's best chance to kind of equalize. But the whole game was putting pressure on black, so his position was not very comfortable, and he got low on time. And when you're low on time, it's hard to come up with good moves. But here rook b4, with the idea of playing bishop a4, exchanging this bad bishop, getting into a rook endgame with at least one active rook, should have probably saved black. Okay, rook c7, and now we can either continue fighting for the c-file or try to attack the pawn on e6. Here, interestingly, the best move was to give up the c-file, and it's quite important to understand why, as usually, of course, don't want to give up open files. But the point is, we have to remember, the point of an open file is to invade into the opponent's camp. But here, the opponent does not have such an ability, because all the entry squares are covered. So white can play on the other file. Now rook c6, let's say king f4, the king can go to e5, and black will forever have to be passive, and someone will have to defend the pawn on e6, and white has an idea of playing f4, g4, f5 to undermine the pawn on d5, and if he takes this one, he will finally have a passed pawn. But rook e1 is also logical. Black gives up the file, and king g5, and as a general rule, when we have an open file, we should try to invade with it. And for example, rook c8, this would be a great move, if not for tactical problems. But rook c8, you don't have to know exactly what the rook is going to do, but it might go to here or here. In either case, it's well placed. But here, as you probably saw, rook f4 wins the pawn, and this would be a problem. After all, white has to give some attention to this pawn, but it's not that easy to attack apart from this. So king f2, king f6, now rook c8, king e7, king e3. Here, white could have exchanged rooks, and of course we should always be a bit careful about exchanging too many pieces, as now in a bishop endgame, if this is not winning, then it will be a bit too late. But it turns out the position is quite good, especially if white takes the time to fix this last pawn after a4 and a5. Now white has an idea of playing the king to e5. Of course, it's not going to be very easy, but it seems white has good winning chances because they also have the idea of going through here. But probably against a low-rated player, it's better to keep some tension. So you decide to do that, and probably king e3 was the better choice. So king d7, the rook moves. Probably the rook should have remained active. Rook h8. Again, you're not really taking the pawn, but you are keeping the black pieces passive. And next you can find the plan. One idea is bishop c2, h4, h5 to ruin the pawn structure, take this pawn, and leave him with a weakness. And again, you always have this a4, a5 idea. So the black rook, if it's passive, it cannot really actively play. So rook c5, king d6, h4, and f4. So we got the perfect structure. Now e5 is impossible. h5, and now we have a clear weakness on g6. And one clear weakness will not really be enough to win the game, but along with e6 and the possibility to do something on the queen side, this should be kind of winning technically for white, even though the computer doesn't really agree. So bishop c2, the bishop belongs on this square, and now you play g3, but instead of g3, I would think the idea of bringing the rook all the way to g3 or g5 might also be a possibility. And from g5 we also have the idea of g4, and after hg to play h5 to use the pin. So I guess the problem might be bishop b5, but we can move away the bishop. And again, even if black takes the c-file, well, which he cannot because this pawn is hanging, there are no entry squares. So rook h1, rook h3, rook g3. The plan is rather simple, and it's black that has to come up with something in the meantime. Rook g3. Now we have one plan less, but that's fine. We have the idea of playing g4, rook c2, and eventually you invaded with the rook again. The pawn played b5, which severely weakens his squares. Now the pawn on a6 is weak. Also the c5 square is forever weak. So now white is just winning. So you invaded. And rook h8, so threatening something. King e7, the rook walks around. And g4. So you decided to play this plan, but now with the move b5 played, I think the win is rather easier. These squares control all the pawn breaks. You could just move the king all the way to the queen side. And if we have a choice of plans, probably the simplest plan is the best plan, especially when the opponent has no time. You can play king e2, and it's very hard for him to come up with a plan. If he plays a5, he will take the pawn. So instead g4, and the only chance was kind of to take and play a5 to put the pawn on b4, to not at least have light squared weaknesses, but still white is close to winning. Rook f7, now you took, so now this is a weakness, and you went to take the weakness, and from here, even though black has an active rook, you managed to take a lot of pawns and promote, so from here the game ended quite swiftly. So I think this is just quite a good game. It is quite an old game though, so I would suggest kind of making the conclusions and moving on, as looking at these old games will not be very useful if you've already analyzed them. And instead, I would suggest playing some new games, so 15 plus 10 online or 20 plus 10 time controls like this. If you don't have anyone to play, you can message me and I'll find you a training partner, but it's important to play some new and long games. So hopefully this was useful, and good luck. See you next time.